Camus, The Plague, Part 2, Chapter 6. Shortly after Father Panelou's sermon, the hot weather set in with a vengeance. On the day following the unseasonable downpour of that Sunday, summer blazed out above the housetops. First, a strong, scorching wind blew steadily for a whole day, drying up the walls. And then the sun took charge. Incessant waves of heat and light swept the town day long, and, but for arcaded streets and the interiors of houses, everything lay naked to the dazzling impact of the light. The sun stalked our townsfolk along every byway, into every nook, and when they paused, it struck. Since this first onslaught of the heat synchronized with a startling increase in the number of victims, there were now nearly 700 deaths a week. A mood of profound discouragement settled on that town. In the suburbs, little was left of the wonted animation between the long, flat streets and the terraced houses. Ordinarily, people living in these districts used to spend the best part of the day on the doorsteps, but now every door was shut. Nobody was to be seen. Even the Venetian blinds stayed down, and there was no knowing if it was the heat or the plague that they were trying to shut out. In some houses, groans could be heard. At first, when that happened, people often gathered outside and listened, prompted by curiosity or compassion. But under the prolonged strain, it seemed that hearts had toughened. People lived beside those groans and walked past them as though they had become the normal speech of men. As a result of the fighting at the gates, in the course of which the police had had to use their revolvers, a spirit of lawlessness was abroad. Some had certainly been wounded in these brushes with the police, but in the town where, owing to the combined influences of heat and terror, everything was exaggerated, there was talk of deaths. One thing, anyhow, was certain. Discontent was on the increase, and fearing worse to come, the local officials debated lengthily on the measures to be taken if the populace, goaded to frenzy by the epidemic, got completely out of hand. The newspapers published new regulations reiterating the orders against attempting to leave the town and warning those who infringed them that they were liable to long terms of imprisonment. A system of patrols was instituted, and often in the empty, sweltering streets, heralded by a clatter of horse hoofs on the cobbles, a detachment of mounted police would make its way between the parallel lines of close-shut windows. Now and again a gunshot was heard. The special brigade, recently detailed to destroy cats and dogs, as possible carriers of infection, was at work. And these whip-crack sounds, startling the silence, increased the nervous tension already existing in the town. For in the heat and stillness, and for the troubled hearts of our townsfolk, anything, even the least sound, had a heightened significance. The varying aspects of the sky, the very smells rising from the soil that mark each change of season, were taken notice of for the first time. Everyone realized with dismay that hot weather would favor the epidemic, and it was clear that summer was setting in. The cries of swifts in the evening air above the housetops were growing shriller, and the sky, too, had lost the spaciousness of those June twilights when our horizons seemed infinitely remote. In the markets, the flowers no longer came in buds. They were already in full bloom, and after the morning's marketing, the dusty pavements were littered with trampled petals. It was plain to see that spring had spent itself, lavished its ardor on the myriads of flowers that were bursting everywhere into bloom, and now was being crushed out by the twofold onslaught of heat and plague. For our fellow citizens, that summer sky, and the streets thick in dust, gray as their present lives, had the same ominous import as the 100 deaths now weighing daily on the town. That incessant sunlight and those bright hours associated with siesta or with holidays no longer invited, as in the past, to frolics and flirtation on the beaches. Now they rang hollow in the silence of the closed town. They had lost the golden spell of happier summers. Plague had killed all colors, vetoed pleasure. That indeed was one of the great changes brought by the epidemic. Hitherto all of us welcomed summer in with pleasant anticipation. The town was open to the sea, and the young folk made free of the beaches. But this summer, for all its nearness, the sea was out of bounds. Young limbs had no longer the run of its delights. What could we do under these conditions? It is Tarrou who points out the most faithful picture of our life in those days. Needless to say, he outlines the progress of the plague, and he too notes that a new phase of the epidemic was ushered in when the wireless announced no longer weekly totals, but 92, 107, and 130 deaths in a day. The newspaper and the authorities are playing ball with the plague. They fancy they're souring off it because 130 is a smaller figure than 910. He also records such striking or moving incidents of the epidemic as came under his notice. That, for instance, of the woman in a lonely street who abruptly opened a shuttered window just above his head and gave 2 loud shrieks before closing the shutters again on the dark interior of a third-floor bedroom. But he also noted that peppermint lozenges had vanished from the chemist shops because there was a popular belief that when sucking them, you were proof against contagion. He went on watching his pet specimen on the opposite balcony. It seemed that tragedy had come to the ancient small game hunter as well. One morning there had been gunshots in the street, and as Tarrou put it, some gobs of lead had killed off most of the cats and scared away the others. Anyhow, they were no longer about. That day, the little old man went onto his balcony at the usual hour, showed some surprise, and leaning on the rail, closely scanned the corners of the street. Then he settled down to wait, fretfully tapping the balustrade with his right hand. After staying there for some time, he tore up a few sheets of paper, went back into his room, and came out again. After another longish wait, he retreated again into the room, slamming the French windows behind him. He followed the same procedure daily during the rest of the work, and the sadness and bewilderment on the old face deepened as the days went by. On the 8th day, Tarrou waited in vain for his appearance. The windows stayed resolutely closed on an all too comprehensible distress. This entry ends with Tarrou summing up, "It is forbidden to spit on cats in plague time." In another context, Tarrou notes that on coming home in the evenings, he invariably saw the night porter pacing the hall like a sentry on his beat. The man never failed to remind everyone he met that he'd foreseen what was happening. Tarrou agreed that he'd predicted a disaster, but reminded him that the event predicted by him was an earthquake. To which the old fellow replied, "Ah, if only it had been an earthquake. A good, bad shock, and there you are. You count the dead and the living, and that's an end to it. But alas, this blasted disease, even them as has got it can't think of anything else. Even them as haven't got it can't think of anything else." The manager of the hotel was equally downhearted. In the early days, travelers unable to leave the town had kept on their rooms. But one by one, seeing that the epidemic showed no sign of abating, they moved out to stay with friends. And the same cause that had led to all the rooms being occupied now kept them empty, since there were no newcomers to the town. Tarrou was one of the very few remaining guests, and the manager never lost an opportunity of informing him that, were he not reluctant to put these gentlemen to inconvenience, he would have closed the hotel long ago. He often asked Tarrou to say how long he thought the epidemic would last. They say, Tarrou informed him, that cold weather stamps out diseases of this type. The manager looked aghast. But my dear sir, it's never really cold in these parts, and anyhow that would mean it's going to last many months more. Moreover, he was sure that for a long while to come travelers would give the town a wide berth. This epidemic spelt the ruin of the tourist trade, in fact. After a short absence, Monsieur Othon, the owlish paterfamilias, made a reappearance in the restaurant, but accompanied only by the two performing poodles, his offspring. On an enquiry it came out that Madame Othon was in quarantine. She had been nursing her mother, who had succumbed to the plague. I don't like it a bit, the manager told Tarrou. Quarantine or not, she's under suspicion, which means that they are too. Tarrou pointed out that if it came to that, everybody was under suspicion, but the manager had his own ideas and was not to be shaken out of them. No, sir, you and I, we're not under suspicion, but they certainly are. However, Monsieur Othon was impervious to such considerations and would not let the plague change his habits. He entered the restaurant with his wonted dignity, sat down in front of his children, and addressed to them at intervals the same nicely worded, unamiable remarks. Only the small boy looked somewhat different. Dressed in black like his sister, a little more shrunken than before, he now seemed a miniature replica of his father. The night porter, who had no liking for Monsieur Othon, had said of him to Tarrou, "That fine gentleman will pass out with his clothes on, all dressed up and ready to go, so he won't need no laying out." Tarrou had some comments on the sermon preached by Panalou. I can understand that type of fervor and find it not displeasing. At the beginning of a pestilence and when it ends, there's always a propensity for rhetoric. In the first case, habits have not yet been lost. In the second, they're returning. It's in the thick of a calamity that one gets hardened to the truth. In other words, to silence. So, let's wait. Tarrou also records that he had a long talk with Dr. Rieu. All he remembered was that it had good results. In this connection, he notes the color of Madame Rieu, the doctor's mother's eyes, a limpid brown, and makes the odd observation that a gaze revealing so much goodness of heart would always triumph over plague. He has also a good deal to say about Rieu's asthma patient. He went with the doctor to see him immediately after their conversation. The old man greeted Tarrou with a chuckle and rubbed his hands cheerfully. He was sitting up in bed with the usual 2 pans of dried peas in front of him. "Ah, here's another of 'em," he exclaimed when he saw Tarrou. "It's a topsy-turvy world, all right. More doctors than patients. Because it's mowing them down, ain't it, more and more? That priest's right. We were asking for it." Next day, Tarrou came to see him without warning. From Tarrou's notes, we gather the old man, a draper by occupation, decided at the age of 50 that he'd done enough work for a lifetime. He took to his bed and never left it again. But not because of his asthma, which would not have prevented his getting about. A small fixed income had seen him through to his present age, 75, and the years had not damped his cheerfulness. He couldn't bear the sight of a watch, and indeed there wasn't one in the whole house. Watches, he said, are silly gadgets, and dear at that. He worked out the time, that is to say, the time for meals, with his 2 saucepans, one of which was always full of peas when he woke in the morning. He filled the other pea by pea at a constant, carefully regulated speed. Thus, time for him was reckoned by these pans, and he could take his bearings in it at any moment of the day. Every 15 pans, he said, "It's feeding time." What could be simpler? If his wife was to be trusted, he had given signs of his vocation at a very early age. Nothing, in fact, had ever interested him. His work, friendship, cafes, music, women, outings, to all he was indifferent. He had never left his hometown except once when he had been called to Algiers for family affairs, and even then he had alighted from the train at the first station after Oran, incapable of continuing the adventure. He took the first train back. To Tarrou, who had shown surprise at the secluded life he led, he had given the following explanation, more or less. According to religion, the first half of a man's life is an upgrade. The second goes downhill. On the descending days he has no claim. They may be snatched from him at any moment. Thus he can do nothing with them, and the best thing precisely is to do nothing with them. He obviously had no compunction about contradicting himself, for a few minutes later he told Tarrou that God did not exist, since otherwise there would be no need for priests. But from some observations which followed, Tarrou realized the old fellow's philosophy was closely involved with the irritation caused by the house-to-house collections in aid of charities, which took place almost incessantly in that part of the town. What completed the picture of the old man was a desire to be expressed several times, and which seemed deeply rooted, the desire to die at a very advanced age. Is he a saint? Tarrou asked himself, and answered yes, if saintliness is an aggregate of habits. Meanwhile, Tarrou was compiling a longish description of a day in the plague-stricken town. It was to give a full and accurate picture of the life of our fellow citizens during that summer. Nobody laughs, Tarrou observes, except the drunks, and they laugh too much. After which he embarks on his description. At daybreak, light breaths of air, light breaths of air fan the still empty streets. At this hour, between the night's victims and the death agonies of the coming day, it is as if for a while plague stays its hand and takes breath. All shops are shut, but on some a notice, closed owing to plague, shows that when the others open, presently these will not. Still half asleep, the newsboys do not yet cry the news, but lounging at street corners offer their wares to the lamp-posts, with the vague gestures of sleepwalkers. Soon, awakened by the early trains, they will fan out through the town, holding at arm's length sheets on which the word plague looms large. Will there be a plague autumn? Professor B says no. Toll of the 94th day of plague, 124 deaths. In spite of the growing shortage of paper, which has compelled some dailies to reduce their pages, a new paper has been launched, the Plague Chronicle, which sets out to inform our townspeople with scrupulous veracity of the daily progress of recessions of the disease, to supply them with the most authoritative opinions available as to its future course, to offer the hospitality of its columns to all, in whatever walk of life, who wish to join in combating the epidemic, to keep up the morale of the populace, to publish the latest orders issued by the authorities, and to centralize the efforts of all who desire to give active and wholehearted help in the present emergency. Actually, this newspaper very soon came to devote its columns to advertisements of new infallible antidotes against the plague. Towards 6 in the morning, all these papers are being sold to the queues that begin to form outside the shops over an hour before they open. Then to the passengers alighting from the trains coming in, packed to capacity, from the suburbs. The trains are now the only means of transport, and they have much difficulty in progressing, what with people standing on the front boards and hanging in clusters from the handrails. A queer thing is how the passengers all try to keep their backs turned to their neighbors, twisting themselves into grotesque attitudes in the attempt, the idea being, of course, to avoid contagion. At every stop, a cataract of men and women is disgorged, each in haste to put a safe distance between himself or herself and the rest. When the first trams have gone by, the town gradually wakes up, early cafes open their doors, and you see an array of cards on the counter. No coffee, bring your own sugar, and the like. Next, the shops open, and the streets grow livelier, and meanwhile, the light is swelling and the sky, even at this early hour, beginning to grow leaden-hued with heat. This is the time when those who have nothing to do venture out on the boulevards. Most of them seem determined to counteract the plague by a lavish display of luxury. Daily, round about 11, you see a sort of dress parade of youths and girls who make you realize the frantic desire for life that thrives in the heart of every great calamity. If the epidemic spreads, morals too will broaden, and we may see again the Saturnalia of Milan, men and women dancing round the graves. At noon, in a flash, all the restaurants fill up. Very quickly, small groups of people unable to find a seat form at the doors. Because of the intense heat, the sky is losing its brightness. Under big awnings, the aspirants to find food wait their turn, aligned along the curbs of streets gaping and sizzling in the fires of noon. The reason for the restaurants being so crowded is that they solve for many the feeding problem, but they do nothing to allay the fear of contagion. Many of the customers spend several minutes methodically wiping their plates. Not long ago, some restaurants put up notices certified that our plates, knives, and forks are sterilized. But gradually they discontinued publicity of this order since their customers came in any case. People, moreover, spend very freely. Choice wines or wines alleged to be such, the costliest extras, a mood of reckless extravagance is setting in. It seems that there was something like a panic in a restaurant because a customer suddenly fell ill, went very white, and staggered precipitately to the door. Towards 2, the town slowly empties. It is a time when silence, sunlight, dust, and plague have the streets to themselves. Wave after wave of heat flows over the frontage of the tall gray houses during these long, languid hours. Thus the afternoon wears on, slowly merging into an evening that settles down like a red winding sheet on the serried tumult of the town. At the start of the great heat, for some unascertained reason, the evenings found the streets almost empty. But now the least ripple of cooler air brings an easing of the strain, if not a flutter of hope. Then all stream out into the open, drug themselves with talking, start arguing or love-making, and in the last glow of sunset, the town, freighted with lovers 2 by 2 and loud with voices, drifts like a helmless ship into the throbbing darkness. In vain, a zealous evangelist with a felt hat and flowing tie threads his way through the crowd, crying without cease, "God is great and good, come unto him." On the contrary, they all make haste towards some trivial objective that seems of more immediate interest than God. In the early days, when they thought this epidemic was much like other epidemics, religion held its ground. But once these people realized their instant peril, they gave their thoughts to pleasure, and all the hideous fears which stamp their faces in the daytime are transformed in the fiery, dusty nightfall into a sort of hectic exaltation, an unkempt freedom fevering their blood. And I too am no different. But what matter? Death means nothing to men like me. It's the event that proves them right.